Hello everyone, I'm Nathan Rich, also known as 火锅大王. Last episode we covered the rise of the Qing Empire, which by 1793 had become massive, and not just in terms of area. The economy was doing well, the population was booming, and tributary nations submitted to China. The empire was strong despite occasional uprisings and wars. Stability was more or less achieved, and the Qianlong emperor was in firm control of his government. Famines came each year on average, and life was no easy experience. But overall, the empire was very stable and prosperous. When the British came asking about a relaxation of trade restrictions, the Qianlong emperor turned them down. He had little use for Western goods, nor of interjections into the daily routines of China. And with his distaste for Christianity, there was no need to let these barbarians into his country. Hundreds of kilograms of opium were being illegally smuggled into the empire by foreigners every day. But the Qing was still profiting from trade. Its share of the world's GDP was estimated at as high as 35% during Kangxi's reign. That's how rich the empire was. 1/3 of the entire world's GDP. Tea, porcelain, and other commodities were gaining popularity in the world. We are at the pinnacle of the Qing's power at this very moment in our story. The empire had seen superior warships and knew that Britain was becoming increasingly aggressive on the world stage. Unbridled capitalism allowed the British East India Company to grow into a formidable military force. Still, the Qianlong didn't initiate meaningful military reform. Our episodes continue to shorten. The first covered thousands of years, the next hundreds, then 100. This episode will cover less than 50, but it's these few decades that represent the last time China had a dynasty entirely free from violent foreign intervention. Now we will see what naive, blind hubris and confidence brought to the Qing dynasty, the coming of a great evil. Welcome back to Epic China. Boundless power. The Qianlong emperor was like his father and his grandfather, but he was getting old. He announced in 1795 he would be stepping down to be replaced by his son, who would become the Qing emperor. He stayed the de facto ruler until his death a few years later, and the Qing was fully in control. The Miao people had rebelled in the 1730s and were crushed by the empire. But the next generation of Miao had grown to adulthood, and they took up arms like their parents. An even bigger Miao rebellion started in 1795. This was a rebellion to watch out for, a threat to stability. While their parents' movement lasted 3 years, the new generation's movement lasted 13. Battle after battle, miniature wars, the empire had their hands full. The ethnicities of China had always been difficult to wrangle. Different languages and cultures within the Chinese Empire spurred many hundreds of major conflicts. The civilization state of China had always fought this disunity. While battling the Miao, there was another White Lotus uprising. The ancient cult had by this time turned into a boogeyman of sorts. The Qing government labeled several unrelated uprisings as White Lotus, and to this day, no one agrees on which were truly cult-inspired and which were peasant uprisings. But more important than the rebellion's origins were its tactics. Unlike in organized wars, the rebels used guerrilla tactics. Stealthy, chaotic, piecemeal combat was proven effective. They battled Qing armies, then just dispersed into the general population as if nothing had happened. Later, they emerged to battle again. The Qing government struggled to put them down and even remarked on the tactics. The rebels are all our own subjects. They are not like some external tribe that can be demarcated by a territorial boundary and identified by its distinctive clothing and language. When they congregate and oppose the government, they are rebels. When they disperse and depart, they are civilians once more. This was a clear-cut example of guerrilla tactics at their most effective, and those tactics paid off. The Qing suffered several major military losses against the White Lotus, and though the rebellion was eventually halted after 9 long years, greater damage had been done than the 100,000 lives lost. The empire, some elites felt, had begun to falter. The British, intent on reversing a growing silver trade deficit, had put enormous pressure on getting the illegal opium trade growing rapidly, and it worked. Silver was vastly important in the international market, being a primary payment method for mercenary armies. By around 1804, opium smuggling into China was getting out of control. And with the massive amounts spent on prolonged battles with the Miao and White Lotus, the country's economy was beginning to slide. In the time of the Qing Empire, China's GDP was a third of the entire world, but that was changing rapidly. The once peaking Qing Empire began to plateau. It was militarily weaker than it should have been. And worse, so much opium was coming in that for the first time in the Qing, China began exporting more silver than it was importing. The flow of power was reversing. Instead of China reaping the benefits of trade, it was spending its precious metals on opium, a commodity which couldn't be harvested or used in any meaningful way. Opium had been banned before, but the government tried to ban it even more explicitly in 1796, and again in 1799, and in 1800. But it was too little too late. Britain was dealing over 1,000 kilograms of opium to China per day, 2,200 pounds. The Qing dynasty was well aware by this point that their ships were inadequate to confront Britain directly, and taking advantage of that fact, British ships were set up as warehouses out in the ocean where Chinese ships were easy to outrun and outmaneuver. Those which caused enough trouble were bribed and brought into the trade. A pipeline was built. Deliver opium from India to warehouse ships, deliver excess profits to the British Empire, repeat. Meanwhile, the warehouse ships offloaded to smaller smuggling ships which brought the illegal drug into China. Smugglers sold to resellers who trickled the product to the addicted, who in turn got more people addicted before eventually dying. And officials were corrupted all along the path. With silver reserves in trouble and opium trading as it was, the Qing Emperor had little chance to initiate an expensive military reform. The empire was still in good condition, just lagging behind in ships and troop quality and with a growing drug problem. To complicate the issue, many officials from the palace all the way down to the smugglers were profiting from the illicit trade. This put conflicts of interest in several positions along the chain of command, which thwarted otherwise genuine attempts at opium controls. British nobility used this corruption as further evidence of China's inferiority and vulnerability. The reserves were draining, with the Qing share of the world's GDP being reduced by half. But these problems weren't insurmountable, not yet anyway. Action could still be taken, but it needed to happen soon. In the first decade of the 1800s, millions of British pounds worth of surplus came into the empire. But that influx was slowing, reversing. And to make things worse, China had a piracy issue. Piracy had always been an issue for China actually, with its massive coastline. And in the early 1800s, one of the most notable pirate interactions began. A famous Guangdong pirate married a prostitute he met in a floating brothel and took her out to sea. Under his leadership, they wielded great power as the Red Flag Fleet. They adopted a boy as their own, who also served on their decks. When that powerful pirate, Zheng Yi, died in 1807, the former prostitute, by this time a skilled pirate, took command of the fleet. Her name had become Zheng Yi Sao, meaning wife of Zheng Yi. She married their adopted son, who had also become an outstanding pirate. At peak, there were 40,000 or more pirates under her command, and more than 300 warships. Zheng Yi Sao, female pirate of South China, and her former adopted son turned husband and second in command, Zhang Baozai. The most powerful and feared pirate ever known to history was a Chinese woman. She and her army of pirates battled the Qing. The ruthless pirates even took British ships. But by 1809, their fleet was finally defeated. The Portuguese, victors of the battle, acted as mediators between the remaining pirates and the Qing. Most of the pirates got off extremely lightly, even joining the Qing Navy. As for Zheng Yi Sao, she spent the rest of her life in Macau peacefully. even offering advice in future maritime affairs. But common folk had little business knowing about pirates. Their lives were occupied with work, the struggle and duty of life, and sometimes the endless onslaught of pain. A famine broke out in 1810 that killed millions of people. In 1811, further famine killed millions more. China had famines nearly every single year throughout its thousands of years of history. It was one of the leading causes of death throughout China's ancient past. As many starved in China, the Western world was shifting as the Industrial Revolution was underway, driven in part by the exploitation of colonies and other countries. In 1812, the United States declared war on Britain, who was trying to prevent American expansionism in Canada. Indigenous people sided with Britain in the war in hopes of establishing their own nation. They wanted representation beyond that afforded to savages. The United States and Britain both claimed victory, but there was one clear losing side. The indigenous people lost forever their hope of establishing a country on their land. They were gradually brought under the control of the United States, which was spreading across their former land. As expansion into the native areas became more profitable, the urgency and violence involved so too increased. In 1813, yet another pseudo-Buddhist White Lotus rebellion flared, with a plot to assassinate the emperor. A small-time cultist led an army toward Beijing. They got into the Forbidden City, but were unsuccessful beyond that. In just a few months, upwards of 70,000 cultists were killed by the Qing. It was another clear message that cultists were not a joke. They were a real danger. The Qing Emperor, heeding his late father's warnings, went further to ban Christianity, which was viewed as less practical and sensible than the traditional religions. But while the White Lotus cult was rebelling, a British translator working for the East India Company finished the very first full Chinese translation of the New Testament. And nothing seemed to stop the endless amount of missionaries sailing up and down China's coast, doing anything they could to illegally smuggle Christianity into the country. Their law was that of God, superior to those of the savage Chinese after all. More urgent than Christianity, though, the Qing tried desperately to crack down on opium. He banned it formally yet again in 1813, and then again in 1815, but few involved paid attention. His orders alone did little to stop the flow. Britain and the United States were smuggling in over 1,500 kilograms of opium per day, double the amount of just 20 years prior. With those profits, Britain had been pushing its will into countries around the globe. Then it began pushing its will into the Qing Empire itself. It began with Nepal. The British East India Company invaded Nepal as suzerain of China. Requests for help were sent to the Qing, but the help never came. Britain dominated Nepal, while the Qing did nothing to resist. This was the first major invasion by Western powers into the Chinese Empire. But the Qing did nothing, and the short-lived suzerainty was dissolved. It had, in the end, amounted to little more than a nominal relationship. Not everyone in Britain believed in this aggressive ideology of market-based expansionism. This incursion forced some British subjects to come to terms with their empire's newfound nature. One author penned his concerns, published in the Asiatic Journal in 1816 after Britain conquered Nepal. He spoke carefully about the coming of what he called a great evil. Of the necessity of entering upon the war with Nepal, I profess myself incompetent to offer an opinion. But I think that I can clearly discern in the occurrence of that war a great, irremediable evil. An evil not to be compensated for by any success in its issue. An evil which, no doubt, would have been great if we had been beaten, but which perhaps is as great or greater because we have finally succeeded. It has multiplied our enemies and our vulnerable points. It has increased our territorial cares and exposed us to new foreign vexations. It has drawn us further from our supplies. It has laid the foundation of new wars. It has added to our temptations to aggrandizement. In a word, the exemption from this evil would have been cheaply purchased, we may believe, by many sacrifices. Not the least of the evils of the Nepal War and its success is the tendency of both to bring us into near contact with the frontiers of China. His words expressed awareness of a new, powerful evil in Britain's global actions, an addiction to violent expansionism. The groundwork was being laid for a new form of tyranny, proto-nationalism blended with supremacism based on race and culture. weapons and technological advancements combined with individualist Christianity. He feared the benefits of that expansionism wouldn't make up for its inherently evil nature. He worried about more wars to come, including with China. Unfortunately, he was more right than he may have known. Despite famines and poor quality of life for the average Chinese, the population grew immensely. One advantage of foreign trade had been the introduction of potatoes and other new crops, expanding the regions of usable land. 350 million, 400 million Chinese. The population continued to boom, as did the amount of opium addicts. Opium sales, already on the rise for decades, began to skyrocket further around 1819. After the Qing Emperor passed away, his son became the Daoguang Emperor. He shared the anti-opium and anti-Christian sentiments of his father and grandfather. The trade warehouses in Guangzhou burned down in 1822, only to be quickly rebuilt. Trade was growing rapidly, and it was beginning to seem nothing could stop the flow of money changing hands. This period was marked by repeated attempts at thwarting the unwanted foreign pressures, opium and religion, control of the Chinese body via illicit drugs, control of the Chinese mind via fantastical individualist religion. In 1826, the Daoguang enacted prison sentences and even death penalties for anyone spreading the disruptive Christian religion. Chinese unwilling to give up their Christian indoctrination were formally sentenced to be given to Muslims as slaves, but it was ineffective. Missionaries continued to expand their efforts in Guangzhou. The 1820s saw multiple battles in an ongoing holy war between exiled Xinjiang rebels and the Qing government. The Qing regained control of its territories by 1827, and most rebellions in Xinjiang had stopped by around 1832. In 1833, Britain removed the East India Company's official monopoly on opium, which opened the floodgates for private British companies to join in on the illegal drug trafficking. Free trade was on the rise. As long as Western nations didn't violate their own laws, they were perfectly willing to enforce the breaking of Chinese laws. Free trade, combined with racial ideas of superiority, was the compass of conduct. Moralists might feel a guilty twinge at the thought of the nature of this product. But was not the drug the staple of the country trade? And was not the country trade in turn the epitome of those values every Anglo-Saxon of age valued most highly? Self-help, free trade, commercial initiative. Thus were twinges ignored, moralists scorned, and doubters derided. If anything, the free traders felt more was due to them. By 1836, opium had become the world's most valuable single commodity trade of the 19th century. Whereas a few decades earlier, millions of British pounds had been brought into China, by this time millions of pounds were exiting China each year. But this interaction between Britain and China was the beginning reveal of a much deeper rift. Laissez-faire was spreading throughout British thought. The abandonment of government control in the economy. Laissez-faire capitalism introduced an imbalance that put further immense pressures on the borders and government of China. A major deficit in free trade concepts was exposed. It, by its very nature, encouraged expansionism, imperialism, and other methods of enforced inequality. It did so, ironically, by seeking parity in trade relations. In effect, laissez-faire on one side required corresponding dissolution of restraints on the other side to restore the functional balance of the trade. It cannot be fully realized with only one side participating fully. It seeks to spread itself in order to operate at its fullest. And that's the pressure by this time growing against China. Open the gates, let us in. Give us money and wealth. Your citizens may die for it. Your country will be under our control, but we will be rich, and trade will be fair. Christianity went hand in hand with the individualist market trade system taking root in Britain. Western missionaries systematically broke Chinese law by attempting every method imaginable to convert Chinese into Christians. They hid biblical texts in bottles and sent them floating toward land. They snuck into the country. They smuggled Bibles in. Anything they could do to illegally spread their religion. They too saw the Chinese rejection of their ideology as an imbalance of freedom. By what right are the millions of Chinese excluded from the knowledge of Christianity? They are most unjustly deprived of even an opportunity to make themselves happy for eternity. If we take upon ourselves the consequences of governmental vengeance, who will say that we do wrong to any man? In other words, illegal or not, it was absolutely a moral imperative that the Chinese culture be removed and replaced with that of the West. Confucianism, Chinese traditionalism, rule by Chinese empire, these are irrelevant. Only individualist Christianity is the right way. In the 1700s, French author and philosopher Voltaire had commented, "The great misunderstanding over Chinese rites sprang from our judging their practices in light of ours. For we carry the prejudices that spring from our contentious nature to the ends of the world." That contentious nature was indeed spreading. In the latest crackdown, scores of opium dealers were arrested, around 2,000 dealers just in 1837. Still, the foreign drug smugglers and native runners kept the market afloat. The already existing ban on opium was intensified. Opium smuggling became a capital offense. Any foreigner or foreigners bringing opium to the central land with design to sell the same, the principal shall most assuredly be decapitated, and the accessories strangled, and all property found on board the same ship shall be confiscated. Philosophical points blended with legal context to create a new debate at the highest levels of the empire. Should opium be legalized? There seemed to be no way to stop it. And when the British traders heard whispers of such a debate, they began stockpiling goods. Opium literally piled up in the warehouse ships off the shores of Guangzhou for the big boom in sales practically guaranteed by legalization. In just 20 years, China spent 20% of its silver currency on opium. 20%. The lower class paid taxes in copper, which had its value versus silver severely reduced and then halved, as silver became more scarce. As taxes went up the chain, copper was converted to silver. So, the more silver China lost, the more expensive life and taxes became for the common people. Farmers, workers, the people of China suffered first this economic impact. An already wide wealth gap widened, and an upper middle class of merchants and regional leaders was emboldened. Meanwhile, the lower class became poorer. While hundreds of thousands of Indians starved to death in yet another of British India's famines, there was pressure on the Chinese emperor to make a decision about opium. In places like Fujian and Guangzhou, over 70% of the population smoked opium. There were so many addicts in China that a government official commented to the emperor, "In the instance of a rebellion, when we have clipped their wings and massacred their wives and children, it only amounts to a few hundred or a few thousands of people after all. But on the other hand, as regards opium smokers, if you wish to annihilate them, I fear that even should you butcher some 80 or 100,000 people, yet would you be as far from affecting your object as ever." Everything changed though by November of 1838, as opium trade had all but stopped. For the first time in over 100 years of illegal Western opium dealing, the trade had finally been completely halted by the Chinese government. The British traders had been hoping opium would be legalized, which would usher in a new era of their free trade narcotic money machine. Instead, trade was brought to a complete stop by a crackdown. The emperor did not legalize opium. Instead, he decided to end the encroachment once and for all. In late 1838, the Daoguang asked a high-ranking official named Lin Zexu to go to Guangzhou and deal with the problem. By this time, over 13 million Chinese were addicted to opium. The foreign drug dealers had been smuggling 7,000 kilos of opium to China every single day, more than 15,000 pounds. Chinese farmers were producing opium domestically, creating yet more conflicts of interest in the opium drama. The empire had been through enough though. Arrests accelerated and the opium trade froze. Sanitariums were open for addicted Chinese across the empire. They tried to do something, anything, about the great evil of opium, forced into their borders by what had also been called a great evil. In their world, perhaps it was the great evil: violent expansionism. But this frozen state of opium trade wouldn't last. Soon we will see just how this great evil planted a black seed in China's soil, one that would grow into a century of unparalleled suffering. And the great Qing, the people of China, the warriors and lovers, poets and farmers would all be forced to their knees by Western imperialism. China and the world would be changed forever. Thanks everyone. 谢谢.